All right. We appear to be live right now. Hi guys.
Hi
Welcome,
there.
welcome,
Hi.
welcome. Let me refresh my Substack screen and see if we are actually live on Substack. Come on, Substack. Give me a break. Well, I think we are. As far as I know, we are live on Substack. So, welcome, Kai Henderson, and welcome, Andrew Postman, to Small Talk Live. This is like a conversation that I have wanted to have for a very, very, very long time. Um, we are going to talk about being advice columnists for women's magazines in the 90s and the early 2000s. This is a question. Sadly, this is one of the most interesting things I've ever done in my career. And I didn't know it at the time. I was just doing something, but I don't know if you guys have had a similar experience where like I can talk about all these things that I've done in my career. But when I tell them that I was an advice columnist for Glamour and Cosmo, I always, depending on who I'm talking to, generally speaking, women of a certain age, they always find it to be quite fascinating. Do you guys have a similar experience?
For sure. I mean, so I'm a professor at a university now, teaching journalism, and when I tell students, like, yeah, I've done national security reporting, gotten angry calls from the CIA about stuff I did, they're like, oh, and then I'm like, and I wrote an advice columnist for Cosmo. They're like, what?
I know.
Yeah.
It's the
Yeah,
thing.
I would say the same thing. I did the Jake A Man's Opinion column for 4 years for Glamour from 1990 to 1994. I actually then did a men's column for Mademoiselle a little bit after that. But the
Awesome.
idea that I was getting paid early in my writing career to write about men, women, dating, love, sex, romance, and doing it under a pseudonym,
I
which
know.
gave me a certain amount of freedom. And then knowing that it was women who would really be interested that I was doing that, even though it was supposed to be this not so secret.
Yeah, I mean, it was great being Jake. That did give me an anonymity. I can't say the word, which was actually quite freeing. Although I did kind of want to reveal to people that I was Jake because it was a good status symbol at the time. But I was also the guy guru. So I was two things. I was what you guys are. Andrew, you were Jake, and Kai, you were the guy guru. The guy guru was Cosmo's answer to Jake. That was not anonymous, although they would always put a fake picture of us. I don't know if Kai, if you got the same thing, or maybe it's just the way I looked, but they would put a picture of like this really handsome guy in the corner for the guy guru. Definitely not me.
Not me either, which is actually fine with me.
Yeah, it's probably fine with me. Well, let's talk about our origin stories of how these even happen. Because Andrew, I'll start with you because you are the veteran here. You did it the earliest among us. How did that job come about? A lot of people always ask me, like, how did you get that job as being an advice columnist for a women's magazine? How did it come about for you?
Well, my first job, my first real job out of college was at McCall's magazine, which does
Yep.
not exist anymore, but it was one of the Seven Sisters women's magazines.
I worked in that
Um,
building, 110 Fifth Avenue, right?
when I was there, it was 230 Park Avenue,
Oh,
I
okay. So,
think.
okay. Yeah, yeah.
Um, and my boss at the time told me that it looked like there was an opening for this men's column at Glamour, which I'd never heard of. And I guess she liked my writing enough that she thought I should apply. And I did. And I think the thing that got me the column is I wrote two columns on spec. One of them was about what a man thinks in the 30 seconds before climax, during climax, and right after climax.
Oh
And
my
then I
God.
did another one that was much more, let's say, tender and about, I don't know, sharing cooking obligations or cleaning, things like that. I wanted to make sure that I was showing sort of the alpha and omega. And I think because it was pretty raw and seemingly honest in the first, and also had a level of compassion, I got it and I loved it. And as I said, I did it for 4 years. I was single when I got it. And about 2.5 years into the gig, I met the woman who I've now been married to for many, many years. And I wrote a little bit about the long distance relationship that we were having at the time. And then I felt at a certain point like, I'm ready to retire. I've said what I need to. It's not like I'm going to be going out all over New York
Right.
dating. I found the woman I love. So
Okay. So, well, it's great that it led to a, well, it didn't directly lead to it, but yeah, like I was writing mine and I'll explain my origin story after we talk to Kai here, but at very different, various stages of my relationship, when I was dating, but then when I was engaged, and then when I got married, I had to stop writing it after I had kids. It was just too ridiculous at that point. But Kai, tell us how you came about writing, becoming the guy guru at Cosmo.
I had written other stories for Cosmo for a while. Both I wrote for a bunch of men's magazines and then got into that. And I went in one day to talk about a feature story I was writing. And one of the editors was like, "We have a deputy editor opening here. Would you be interested?" And I said, "I don't think so." I was freelance and really enjoying it. But you always, see what the deal is. And like 2 weeks later, I accepted the job. So I was like, Cosmo's lone straight male editor I stayed there for 2 years or so. And then it was, John, I edited you.
I forgot about that. You did edit me.
While you were doing it. And then this was, around the Great Recession time. So everyone was tightening their belts. And so the editors were like, "Why don't we just bring this in-house and have you write it?" And I said, "Okay." And then I learned an amazing lesson from you, because I emailed you to let you know that they were doing that. And I believe you called me and said, because that's horrible news, right? It was such a good freelance gig and good money. And you called me very nicely. You're like, probably a phone call would have been better about that. And I've never forgotten that lesson. It was great. And
really?
6 years later, the same thing happened to me. I got a short email from my editor saying, "Actually, we're all done." So,
I hope you called the next person. Yeah, no, I mean, that's great that meant something you got. It's amazing when you hear that later. Yeah, I mean, we all know as freelancers, it's like a game of Jenga when you're, putting together your career. I still have this situation, and it's like if somebody just pulls out one check a month, suddenly everything's like, collapsing. So I was probably like, that was probably a nice check that I was getting, at least in those days, from Cosmo. But anyway,
it was a very nice check. Yeah.
But now I understand the economics behind it. That was also like towards the end of magazines. That was getting close to being the last final 5 years of the actual print magazine. So my story, so we're keeping track here. I was a staff editor at Glamour. And I was also the only straight guy on the staff. It was nice to be the only straight guy on a staff of 75 women. I have to say, although nothing ever really happened, it was just a pleasant experience. It just kind of by default fell to me, just like it sort of by default fell to you. But I had been writing advice columns or writing about relationships since way before, since my days when I was at Child magazine, which was owned by the New York Times Group, which owned McCall's, I think, at the time. I don't know if they owned it at the time that you were working there, Andrew, but they owned McCall's, they owned Family Circle, they owned Child magazine. It was this crazy thing. The New York Times owned these weird magazines that you would never associate with the New York Times. But I was sharing a floor at the time when I was at Child magazine with YM magazine. And I would I was 23 years old, and I would hang out in like the water cooler area, and I would always chat with the women from YM, and they would be like, "You should write for us," and so that's how that came about. So that's how I ended up getting into the relationship writing business. But I had no right to write about relationships. I mean, I had no background. It's funny because this is like my karma. So now I'm married to a therapist, a family therapist who has a lot of couples. And she's like, "How did you have that job? I went to school for, 5 years to be an expert in this. And you're just like sitting down and writing stuff off the top of your head." But I think that was sort of probably the beauty of it, that I was like the everyday guy. And we were all that. So we start writing these columns, and, let's talk a little bit about the process. It might have been different for each of you guys. Kai, you and I probably had somewhat of a similar experience, obviously, because we worked at the same place. But Andrew, let's start with you. Like, a lot of people ask me, where the questions, well, you didn't get questions. So let's specify. Jake is more of a column about some topic that's on your mind, that is relevant, right? At least that's what it was. That's relevant to women and relationships and understanding women. And it's written by this anonymous guy, Jake. But how did you come up with the ideas for your column?
Well, I mean, I never felt like I had to really dig to come up with the next month's column. I don't even know if I ran it by the editor. It might be traveling together. It might be meeting parents of your girlfriend. It might be what is a long distance relationship like. It might be, I will say this. I mentioned that I met the woman that I married to
Yeah.
while I was doing this on a blind date. And I had just written a column about how blind dates are completely oversold. They rarely work. And so about 6 months after that, I essentially wrote a retraction like, okay, maybe I spoke too soon. I didn't, you're right that Jake, unlike certain other advice columns, I didn't get questions and respond to them. On the other hand, given that it was a heyday for magazines and
Yeah.
it was read by millions of women in a certain demographic, every column would garner lots and lots of letters. And
Yeah. Oh,
so
that's
I would
interesting.
get ideas from that. But I would say probably the biggest source of my ideas was my group of guy friends who I would
Yeah.
go to. There'd be 8 or 10 of them. Some were, more wildcats than others. Some were in steady relationships. Some were more down on themselves. Some drank more. Some were in New York, different industries. And I would rely on them I wouldn't want it just to be my view of things. I
Yeah.
would change their names and I would change their professions. And I sort of got goofy with their professions. I would just sort of make things up like, like part-time ichthyologist, because it didn't to me really matter what they were.
Yeah.
It's like each of these guys is not only saying something true, but it's especially true because I'm changing their names and I'm under a pseudonym as well. So you may not like what some of these guys are saying about relationships and about men and women, but I'm trying to give you something
Like
that's
the
helpful and
real.
unvarnished. Exactly.
Yeah. Kai, what did you, I mean, this is interesting actually, because you were behind the scenes. You were my editor there. Do you remember where the questions were coming from? Like, were they half coming from real readers and half kind of like not?
They actually weren't made up.
Yeah.
Mostly they came from readers who, this was many years ago. So they either email just like a general email address for the column. We would get them like snail mail style. People would mail in questions. No, so if editors had questions themselves, they'd submit them, or their friends had questions. I mean, we of course did that. But they were all real. Like, we weren't just
Yeah.
making stuff up because we wanted to write about X, Y, or Z.
Right. No, I think, and that's a good thing that we're dispelling that myth, because I think there's a myth that, like, a lot of times people, when they're talking to me about this, they'll be like, those questions weren't real, right? You guys just made them up on staff. And I'm like, I don't think so. I mean, I didn't know the process because I was, when I was doing the Guy Guru column, you guys would send me questions every month, and then I'd have to kind of sit down and think about them. And then when I was doing Jake, it was really just like my own, like, what I was going through. I think I had a similar experience to you, Andrew. I would kind of like talk to my guy friends, but I would just like, what am I going through right now? And I was looking, I only wrote about maybe 6 or 7 Jakes because I was only at Glamour for a year, but I wrote like about the third date, like how the third date is like the pivotal date. Like, if you're going to go on a third, and which is not a radical idea, but I think it was a fairly new idea back then. And I wrote about how much I hated Valentine's Day, and I still hate Valentine's Day. It's the worst. So that was kind of fun. Do you,
But
I mean, I
one
know,
thing I just want to say, one thing I discovered, I told you right before we went on that I wrote a novel about my experience called Now I Know Everything,
I
which
love
is
that.
basically about a guy who has the exact experience that I had. And in doing so, I did some research and I went back and I looked at some of the Jakes. It started in the 1950s. And what's interesting, you talk about how the idea of the third date being the pivotal date and Valentine's Day. And of course, what you and I and Kai were writing about were pretty much the same, only there's a different veneer on it. There's a
Yeah.
column in the 50s, the late 50s, I think, a J column, where he's talking about something about a woman who wears white gloves to dinner, something like that you would
Yeah.
never write about now. But then it wasn't that far off from me writing about how formal do you feel with people and how comfortable. It's all the same thing, and it just sort of has each era comes with its own particularities. But as far as the anxieties and the yearnings and all of that, I mean, I do think that's universal, which is why those columns have been around.
Yeah,
for
we're so
long.
popular. And it's interesting because they don't seem to be around as much now, although I guess they just take a different form. I'm going to try one technical thing here. I'll be right. Oh, that worked better. See, now I can see the three of you at the same size. This is much better. Yeah. Do you think so? I was looking back. Kyle asked you this question. As I was looking back and looking at the questions from like 20 years ago. And I'm wondering, like, is that this form of like advice column, do you think it's dated now, or do you think it would still resonate today, or it still resonates today? Like the kinds of stuff you were answering back then, do you feel like does it feel like, oh my God, that's so like 1990 or whatever? I mean, it wasn't for you, it was like 2006, but what's your feeling of that?
Kyle, you want to take that?
Yeah, Kyle, you start.
Yeah, I think people kind of still wonder the same things, but there's so many more outlets now to go find that information. I mean, some of the letters we got were wondering really, really, really basic things that any teenager on the internet can find in 2 seconds, right? So
Right.
I think in that way, it's a little anachronistic. I would also, I think especially those women's magazines, all magazines tell their advertisers here who our readers are. And I think probably at Cosmo that, I forget what it was mostly women in like 20s and 30s. But in reality, a lot of our readers were younger than that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that, and so we're, a lot of the questions. And so I think the idea of a dude with no academic credentials in his 30s giving like sex and relationship
a
advice
white
to
dude,
maybe
especially
a 17-year-old. I would guess that most people wouldn't think that's a great idea now. And I did it. I'm sure we all did, worked really hard to give good advice. I had written about sex and relationships forever and talked to lots of experts. So I had, by osmosis, I had a bunch of that stuff in my head. And I also talked to some experts when I was writing those responses. But yeah, I'm not surprised that it's not as common as it used to be.
Yeah. And the messengers are probably changed. Andrew, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say, to Kai's point, I think right now there could be such a columnist who could have a loyal following, but I think it would be much smaller and it would be deeper because people want authenticity and they want to connect with a voice that sounds. But to Kai's point, there's just so much fragmentation now that an individual cannot speak to all of those people, and many of those people don't think that, as you said, 30-year-old white guy or white straight guy, whatever it might be, or a guy living on the coast, really can speak to what they're thinking about, which makes me a little sad to think that we have become so fragmented and so tribal that you can't have someone saying something that kind of applies
to everybody.
If not everyone, then a very significant chunk. I mean, now the Super Bowl is the one thing that everyone watches. It used to be there'd be 30 shows that we had in common, and it's just technology and the way of the world has changed that, and that's true with
I mean that's true with everything.
Too. Right.
It's true with I mean, I talk about this sometimes in my column. It's like back in the 80s when I was growing up, there was like, 5 superstars, and everybody knew like Michael Jackson, Madonna, Prince. Now it's basically Taylor Swift is the only person that's sort of like a celebrity for all, and it's
Beyonce
just changed.
too. I feel like she's in that.
Beyonce. Yeah, totally true. Beyonce's definitely in that place. So I agree. I feel like, it kind of started changing. I felt like when Dan Savage started writing about, did you guys ever Savage Love? And he was suddenly writing about the gay community, which was great because it was an alternative to what we were doing. A little deeper into the sexual side of stuff, which kind of brings me up to the subject of like, what were the taboo topics at the time that we were just not really, and it's probably had a lot to do with advertising more than like where the culture was. But like, were there certain topics that you knew like we couldn't cross that line in terms of giving advice? Do you remember any of those? I mean, I feel like, well, I don't remember ever writing about anything that had to do with like gender fluidity or anybody being gay. I know I never got a question about, is my boyfriend gay? Or, or maybe if I got that question, it would be like framed in kind of a bad way. It wouldn't be framed in like, it would be framed more like, how do I know if he's gay? So I shouldn't be dating him kind of thing. Do you guys remember like any kind of taboo topics that you weren't allowed to cross? Andrew, do you?
I wouldn't say taboo. I would say that I was pretty good about staying in my lane, to use
Yeah.
a cliche. And again, to the point I just made, thinking that if I said something true and thoughtful, that it could apply to someone who maybe wasn't straight or wasn't white or wasn't this or that. But I think it would have been, I would have felt it was presumptuous for me to say anything about, well, certainly it wouldn't be about gay men because it's Glamour magazine and,
Right.
18 to 29-year-old millions of women. And that's, as Kai said, that's not their advertising base. It would make no sense really to do that. And maybe, who knows, maybe a more adventurous columnist than myself would have done that. But I think you feel like, okay, I can have enough fun and say enough what I think are true things in this forum that I don't need to, try to break them. They're doing me a favor by giving someone in their late 20s who wants to be a writer and paying me a monthly check that I can deliver in that way, that, I'm not here to be Hunter S. Thompson or William Burroughs or whatever, So,
and you can't be something for everyone. You are who you are, and you can write to your authentic experience. Yeah. And it's like, that's my experience. And Kai, what did you have that? Do you remember being in the Cosmo room and being like, we can't really go there?
I mean, you had mentioned, I definitely answered at least once or twice over 6 years, a question along the lines of, is my boyfriend gay?
Right.
So, we could answer that, but, again, it's like you're learning, someone maybe wrote a letter or it's like 100 words or 50 words about their life or about their boyfriend. So it's a hard question.
Right. Yeah. It's a hard question.
The real answer is, I don't know.
Right.
But
in
so
most
we
cases,
could definitely,
that's the answer.
Yeah, we could definitely do that. When we wrote about, people want to think this about Cosmo, but when we wrote about sex, we were pretty careful about not getting too graphic. So that was definitely something that we had to steer around. Honestly, for me, not that it was taboo per se, but I always say about 80% of the questions I answered, the answer was break up with him. That was the real answer.
So true.
But you can't just keep writing that over and over, right? Like usually I think it was 6 or 7 questions per issue was what I answered. And so often I'd be like, okay, which one of these is the most egregious? And I can at least end my answer with, maybe you should break up with them or something along those lines, right? Everything else had to be more actionable in a quote unquote positive way. Although you could argue whether that was positive ultimately, but so that was almost the biggest taboo, is I couldn't keep repeating that over and over.
That's true. It's like and also trying to find out other ways to write the word kissing, or some of those words that keep coming up, my guy and your dude. That's interesting. Then they came up, somebody at Sex and the City, and I should know his name, but I don't know his name off the top of my head, came up with the "he's just not that into you," which was another kind of underlying thing, which I thought was pretty smart. Actually, I was kind of annoyed that he came up with it and not me. But that idea that he's just not that into you, sometimes that's just the case. Like, there's nothing wrong with you. He's just not that into you. And that's why he's doing these things.
Some guys are jerks.
I would. This reminds me what Kai said. I'm taken back to when I was doing it, and you want to give. Again, you want to be honest, and this is the idea of inside. What is a guy really thinking? And more often than not, when I would get mail, the women would be pretty much saying something that you kind of want to say, like, I think you've answered your own question. You may not want to hear this. And yet, again, to Kai's point, you don't want to say it over and over again. But it's like, well, if those are the signals you've been getting, if this were me, if I run either side of this and I had the objectivity, I would save myself the next 2 to 5 years or a lifetime of heartache. Not that people can't change, but again, the whole point is, what are you as a 20-something guy or a 30-something guy thinking about? And unfortunately, in cases, like, I can see where this is going, and kind of, save yourself. The call's coming from inside the house.
What were the questions that we got the most, or the issues that came up, the topics that came up the most? It seemed like there was a lot of a repeat. And again, Kai, you read a lot of the letters that came in. I would get a lot of repeat questions. They would just be framed in different ways. Andrew, you mentioned that there was certain topics that had been repeating, since the 50s. Are there any topics that come to? I'll go first here. So one thing that constantly kept coming up was, how do I know he wants to be more than just a friend? That was a big one, where it was like there was always this couple, like it was the Harry Met Sally kind of thing, where it's like this couple that was like, you know, somebody at work or somebody that they've been hanging out with, and it's like, how do I get past the friend zone? And again, the answer was sometimes like, well, if you haven't gotten past the friend zone by now, it's probably just meant to be, you're probably just meant to be friends, right? Because I think he would have let you know. But I got that question a lot. Did you guys get did you even write about that, Andrew, back in the day? Do you
Yeah,
feel like a friend?
one of the most common is related, but slightly different from what you're saying. It wasn't the friend zone, but what you said about the third date, it was more about the pivot. In other words,
Yeah.
we've been going out for 5 dates or 6 months or a year and a half, and he's happy with just keeping it where it is. And how do I know eventually he's going to come around? That kind of thing. I would say I got that a lot. So which really comes down to interpreting what someone says versus what they really mean.
Right.
Which is
right.
Which is probably like 93% of it.
And again, we had like zero background information. It wasn't like, we could do a background check. Like it was like we had the 100 words that somebody wrote in a letter as our, so it's not like we're a therapist who's like hearing this for years and like knows every detail and like their family background and this guy and that. It's like, I know, an example that she gave me of something like he might have done on one date, and then I have to go off of that. So I don't know. Kai, do you remember any like frequently asked questions from Cosmo?
It was so long ago. But the first thing I thought of when you asked that question was some variation of how do I read his mind?
Yeah.
And again, the answer is talk to him, ask him.
Yeah.
Like that's the answer to that question.
Right.
But again, it's like, well, if he does this, maybe it means that. And if he says this, and maybe you can do this. And but I think that was probably the overwhelming thing that people wanted to do. Was it was almost like sometimes they didn't want to bother the guy with their insecurities or wants or needs or whatever. And unfortunately, probably sometimes I encouraged that sort of like, don't do anything that might bother him, right?
Yeah, that's true.
That's probably the thing I regret. Probably the only thing I really regret about that is any answers I gave that were like, here, you have to do all this emotional labor for this goofball, rather than just like being honest with them or telling him what you need.
Either dump him or just tell him what you need, or say, you know what, you're not giving me what I need, so I want out.
There's another prevailing thing I would say, which is the idea of people writing you and knowing the answer, but it's a little scary to go ahead and do it. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite scenes in Notting Hill, which is after Hugh Grant has decided he can't have his heart broken again by Julia Roberts, and he comes back to his friends who've been with him for years, and they ask him what happened, and he explains, yeah, I just broke up with the gorgeous American movie star because I'm just a little fragile, whatever. And they're all kind of nodding, and he's like, I did the right thing, didn't I? And they briefly nod, and then like, how daft are you? You're just a prick. This is not the right answer. You know it. We know it. Anyone who would hear this would know it. And I don't want to say it's all quite that level, but I think a lot of us, again, it's kind of scary to confront what you sort of know. You wouldn't be writing about it if you didn't feel like, okay, there's something not quite right to begin with. So.
Yeah, and I guess the advice is sort of like, well, if you sort of think there's something there, it's probably something there, right? I don't know. What's that something edge? What's that something's edge? Sometimes the simplest explanation is the one that's actually the explanation. Yeah, I mean, Kai, you said you have any regrets, and I always joke like, oh yeah, I'm the person who basically ruined your teenage years, forgot, like I make that joke that I'm the one who gave you horrible advice throughout your teenage years. I don't really have regrets. I know that there have been some like articles written more recently that like, oh, those magazines of that time were, really bad for women and, maybe perpetuated stereotypes that were not healthy. But I was looking back at my advice columns that I wrote, 20 years ago, and I don't feel like there's anything in there that's harmful or, that I probably wouldn't say today. I might frame it slightly differently today, but do you guys have any regrets? Is there anything you've ever kind of written that you were like, oh, I probably shouldn't have said that? It was just like, that was the times, or I was writing more for the magazine's voice than my own, voice.
Well, I have one by far, the thing
Yeah.
that I wrote, and I'm not going to say I regret it, but I
Right.
got more letters about this by a factor of 10 than any other column I did in the 4 years. And I said I had a lot of throat clearing at the beginning of this column.
Mhm.
And it was talking about the volume of drinking on the part of women and men. And I
Mhm.
wasn't saying, I was very upfront saying, this is not me blaming women. This is not me putting the onus on women. I saw it more as a safety issue and saying
Right.
that a 110-pound woman who's going drink for drink with her boyfriend or some guy she met at the bar who weighs, 205,
Right.
things can happen, not with the majority of men, but there
Right.
are, bad things can happen. And so I wrote this column, and it was not only was it the greatest volume I got, but you could cut it right down the middle.
Yeah.
50% of women thanking me and saying, "You're so right. I'm glad you said this for me, for my friend, for whatever." And then 50% calling me a misogynistic pig. And why are you saying this? We shouldn't have to,
Yeah.
look out for what we do. But so again, I don't regret it. And I think I framed it the way it was meant to be framed. But it certainly was, I guess you'd say, the most provocative thing that I wrote in those 4 years.
Well, that's probably a good thing. It made people actually respond. I never remember getting any feedback from my readers. That would have been so, but this was like I sort of did in the middle. I sort of did after snail mail, but sort of too early to get lots of emails. Kai, is it anything that any stories you ever worked on that you are like, probably shouldn't have written that or whatever? Are you good? Your conscience is clear.
I think it's pretty clear. I mean, like you said, definitely stuff that I would have said or recommended that I probably for sure wouldn't do anymore. And just I think the nature of the job is you can't, I had, I don't know, 100 words to answer a question. And again, from let's say a 50-word email. So you kind of have to you can't really get into a ton of nuance, right? And so some of it was probably really reductive, like men are like this and women are like this.
Yeah.
That maybe wasn't always super helpful. But we worked really hard to make sure that I worked hard to make sure I gave good answers, and then the editors at Cosmo, I mean, were great and super smart.
Yeah.
And so,
I always felt like I would be if I wrote the wrong thing, you guys would catch it anyway. So you wrote something that could be particularly destructive or harmful, you guys would catch it. Yeah. It occurs to me though, you were saying that like most of the questions are like explain the male brain, and I must have in my career written, 100 stories that are in that vein of like, I mean, I think the first thing I ever wrote was like a letter that a guy wrote to his girlfriend breaking up, but then or a love letter that a guy wrote to his girlfriend or a girl that he wanted to start being his girlfriend, and then like dissecting what every word actually meant, like what he wrote and what he actually meant. That was always like the thing. Guys decoded, right? That was always like a big thing. And in some ways I had to, and I'm not like, I don't going to say I'm like the most evolved man of all time. Obviously I'm probably more evolved or I'm probably as evolved as, or I don't know, how do you put this? I'm an evolved man, kind of a liberal, grew up a liberal man with, feminist mom. And, I'm not like, but I had to sometimes put on the hat of somebody that I not really, it's like almost more of an everyman hat that I had to sometimes wear when I was answering these questions. So like the way I would answer for myself might be a little bit different than I think like most average guys would. Did you guys find yourself having to do sometimes the same thing where I had to sort of like, like, again, like, instead of just saying, break up with him, take agency, this guy's a jerk. I'd have to be like, well, sometimes guys do this because they want to do this, but it wasn't me that I was talking about. I was just talking about like some everyman that I would have like this avatar that I would imagine. I don't even know if he had a name, but it was kind of like this guy that I knew in college that was kind of more of a douche than I was, right? But was probably more like most guys, Do you know what I mean? I don't know if that was a long way of explaining that. It was sometimes I had to put on a little bit of an act to answer the questions.
Yeah. I would say that one thing I wanted to do is I wanted to get at the nuance.
Yeah.
Not just the decoding, but that, I know this sounds corny, but to make each guy, just like each woman, be a complex individual and not like, okay, you can separate guys into categories. There's the Cro-Magnon, there's a different kind of douche, there's the sweet, he'll do anything and you can walk all over him. You got to be careful of that too.
Right.
There's a guy who's sleeping around but doesn't really want to, and he's got mommy issues. There's this or that. And once you start doing that, I think it's untrue. And I think then we as guys are not sort of would not be performing the service that women readers would want, which is, I don't really believe that about guys. I don't believe that even the douches and the bros out there are just douches and bros. I mean, I don't think that's true about anyone of any gender or whatever. So it takes a lot of work to get at what that guy said in that breakup love letter, or the one where he wants to be your boyfriend, whatever, while knowing that, to Kai's point, if you got 100 words, or in my case, 850 to 1,000 words, you can only get so nuanced, but at least leave open that window for, we can't say, if we paint in such broad strokes, then we've done service, basically.
Yeah. Do you guys remember the weirdest question you ever got, or the one that, or the kind of, for you, Andrew, maybe the toughest topic that you ever had to answer? I'll go first because I don't, and it's funny because I was looking for it, and I guess I didn't save everything I ever wrote, but I did save a lot of things. I'm glad I did now. But it was something about my boyfriend has started wanting to expose himself a lot in public. And, at first it was kind of like, I thought it was kind of funny, but now he'll like do it in a restaurant and he'll do it. Is that weird? Is that something that I should be concerned about? And I'm like, yeah, like that was a really weird question. And I remember I even called a therapist because I was like, I don't even know how to answer this in a way. Like, I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer this just on my own. I don't know anybody who does that. I've never done that. That was a weird question that I can't remember. I wish I'd remembered how I'd answered. I'm sure I was like, you're, get him some help, or, you should maybe talk to him about getting some help on that. Cause that's not like, there was definitely some times I would have to answer, be like, I would suggest that you get, call a therapist about this. This is, a little bit out of my wheelhouse.
I would also say that's doubly troubling if the way she presented it was, at first I thought it was
it was funny. Yeah, at first she's like, first it was like kind of funny. Like we would be like on a subway and he would expose himself and I'd be like, oh, stop it. But then it was weird when we were at my parents' house and I'm like, what the fuck is this?
My God.
I know. But I was like, thanks guys for sending me this question. But I mean, it was obviously a real question. But Kai, do you remember any like weird topics from back in the day?
Man, I wish I could remember specifics, but that sort of question, that my boyfriend is doing this, please tell me that's okay. And it's like, no, it's not. It's not okay. Like even that letter that you just talked about, John, where she's like, at first I thought it was kind of funny. I'll bet she did not think that at first, right? I'll bet she's just trying to tell herself that this is okay.
Right.
There's a ton of that.
Yeah, or hoping that I would say, you're right, that is kind of funny at first, but then if it's too much, then, if he's doing it too often and it's like, no, that's just completely inappropriate. So I hope if she's watching now, she knows that, and she's not with that guy anymore, or he's gotten some serious help. Let's see. Let me think. I wrote a bunch of other questions. How much do you think your answers were rewritten to sort of fit the tone of the magazine, like of like what the message that the magazine wanted to get out to the world, right? I mean, we've kind of touched on this already. There was a sort of angle, I think, that they wanted, that might not have always conformed to reality. Does that make sense? Like, and again, the editors are smart people. They're not trying to mislead, but they're also like cognizant of like what might upset an advertiser or what might upset the readers to the point where it's going to like, not conform with what they're trying to put out there in the world. Do you think that played a part in your answers somewhat?
Go ahead, Kai.
I think just because I was there for part, for
you're on both sides. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. The short answer is yes. I mean, Cosmo had a pretty singular voice. Like some magazines were, Esquire had all sorts of voices in it, but Cosmo's pretty singular. Everything kind of had the same voice. And so, John, you had talked about like an avatar you imagined that wasn't you, but was giving that advice. And I think I wrote in a way that was what Cosmo thinks of as a dude, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
But I will say, by and large, like we weren't edited like super heavily. Like, no, you have to say this and this and this. They genuinely did want to know what someone who was male thought. But every so often, it'd be like, we can't give them this advice, or that sort of thing, or we just told them to do this on page 11, so you can't tell them to do the opposite thing in your column. Like every so often, that sort of thing would happen, but not a lot.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable how there wasn't a heavy-handed edit, unless you said something that really, I think, was like off, just totally off. I can't think of even a time that I did that. I think sometimes it would just be like the edits would mostly be in the sort of like language of like I couldn't always say kissing. Like they would be like, smooch. There would just be like kind of funny little like wordplay things that I actually, just having worked at women's magazines for a long time, kind of became an expert in that kind of. And it was funny because it wasn't really the way people talked, but it was kind of the tone of those magazines at the time was the kind of like a smooch fest, or, you would say things like that instead of just saying like kissing, you would have these like ways of saying. And it was funny because when I went to work later at Maxim magazine, or actually I went to work at Stuff magazine, I remember I was still kind of writing in that tone for men's magazines. And my editor, who was British, I never forget that Andy Clarkson. I don't know if you remember him, Kai, but he came up to me. He's like, why do American writers write in this weird way that they don't talk? Like nobody says like you write in this like strange, like coded language. And I don't understand why you do that. And I was like, God, I hadn't even realized that. I've been writing like that for so long for women's magazines. I hadn't even noticed that I had kind of stopped writing in a conversational way. And it was like actually a good note, because we tried to make stuff which was new at the time a little more, like the way a guy would really talk. But Andrew, did you have that when you were writing back in the 90s? Did you have to kind of put it in that kind of coded language that
I actually didn't feel that. I felt I had a lot of freedom from Glamour, from my editors, from just the brand itself.
That was Helen Gurley Brown at the time. Oh no, who was
no, she editor? Glamour was
Cosmo.
Ruth Whitney was the editor-in-chief, and then I had a couple of different editors over the column. Maybe part of it being under pseudonym, it almost seemed like it was, like we don't endorse necessarily the positions here. But given that everything, Cosmo and Glamour weren't obviously exactly the same. I mean, what they're known for. And so I felt like I was more the lone voice talking in this way, not to, just any of the Jakes, whereas Cosmo, everyone knew about the Cosmo Girl and about Sex and the Single Girl from Helen Gurley Brown and sex and relationships and all of that. Glamour had a lot of, I know had more about women's health and politics and policy and things like that. So to have this, not that they didn't have relationship pieces, but they didn't have, like the Cosmo quiz that everyone wanted to take and say, oh, where do I stack up on this or that? So I felt like I was given free reign. And as I said, given the fact that I got the job in part by starting with a column, it was called The 3 Stages of Man, about, again, the radical mind change, like in the middle of, sexual climax. So it's kind of like, okay, this is fun and funny and hopefully enlightening. We'll let this guy go do his thing. And I never.
You were sort of an anachronist. Yeah, you were sort of you weren't quite like in the spirit of what Glamour was about at that time. I mean, Glamour would eventually basically just become Cosmo.
Right.
But yeah, but I feel like in the 90s, maybe before the Bonnie Fuller era, which is when I was there, it was definitely more the Ruth Whitney was had a lot more politics in it, had a lot more, like it was more of a serious, not that I was like a regular reader of Glamour,
Right.
but from what my understanding, it's almost a difference between Cosmo was like Maxim and Glamour was like GQ or Esquire, right? Like Cosmo was like the fun one for younger girls that want to read
Right.
about sex. Of course, they all read they both read the same magazines, but I think that was the way it was positioned, at least for a time. Yeah. So
Right. I think so.
Jake would have been very different kind of. When I was there, Jake was just another one of those columns about what guys think.
Right. Kind of a
Yeah.
brand extension instead of an outlier.
Yeah, exactly. Kai, this is sort of a little bit off the topic. You and I would later go on to work at men's magazines, or you might have even worked at a men's magazine before I worked. Cause I don't remember before. Yeah. Wasn't it I had to start writing it, not advice, but I guess, yeah, advice for men, as opposed to advice for women. It was interesting, the difference. Did you note it when you started working on stories that were more targeted men? I always felt the men's stories were more about performance, and the women's stories were all about, connection, emotional connection, and men's stories were all about how to last 10 times longer, it's like it was definitely different. Did you find the same thing?
Well, we always had women editors do our advice, much like,
right. That's true. Dawn Yannick and yeah.
So they handled most of that stuff, but yeah, like you said, completely different. But part of the reason I think I was hired on at Cosmo was because I'd had that experience, and they wanted me to come on after I think Kate White, who's like the legendary editor there at the time.
Yeah.
They hadn't had someone like the boy editor or whatever since the 90s, and this was 2008. Right. They wanted that real kind of voice. But I will say, once I started, it quickly became apparent that I'm not sure they wanted it, really, because it was too dissonant to maybe what Cosmo sort of was about, and like I said, how similar the voice was. So
you had to tone it down.
So definitely different, but it is interesting that men's magazines made sure it was a woman, and then women's magazines made sure it was a man.
Yeah. That's good. Do you guys have favorable memories of any editor? Who was one of the best editors? Did you work directly with Ruth Whitney, Andrew, or did you?
No, I had to. I worked with Judy Daniels. I worked with Judy Coyne. I worked with
Judy Coyne's name I totally know.
The great Jill Herzig, who's also a friend. I was very lucky. I also did a bunch of features under my name that were kind of like, this is what men are thinking. I remember going on Good Day New York, and talking about it, like back again when magazines had cover stories and they were selling enough of them that promoting it on a monthly basis was a big deal. But yeah, I would say Judy Coyne was terrific, and Jill Herzig was terrific.
Kai, I remember working with Jenny Benjamin. You were great. Jenny Benjamin, John, what was John's last name? That was also the novelist. I can't think of his name. He's been on my podcast. I'm terrible. Sorry, John.
Searles.
What's that?
John Searles.
John Searles. Love John Searles. What made a good editor in your opinion? Like, was it somebody that just laid off your writing, or was it somebody that, like, you guys have worked with a lot of editors. What's been your experience of a positive experience with a really strong editor?
I think someone who knows what they want. And can like clearly let you know what it is, even if it's like a total rewrite. Like, at least I know where I have to go with this. At Cosmo, like I said, I felt a little like, I don't know if out of place is there. It's not like we weren't welcoming, but I just, my sensibility or whatever just wasn't. I got there after a couple of years, but editors who were able to acknowledge that and still interact with me, like John, I think you knew Michelle Promolenko, right?
Oh yeah, she's great. She was at
she was great. Then Nikki Phelan came in after her. Nikki was amazing, like so funny, and like, totally got it that, some of this stuff maybe isn't for us, but it is what the magazine is. And that always helped me a lot. It was just kind of like a reality check or something. You talked about the language, like smooches, or I had totally forgotten until you just brought that up. all
right,
those euphemisms that I had to have in my
right.
head.
And there's
Oh
only
my
so many ways you
gosh.
could say hair. Hair was a tough one when I was like editing beauty. You can't say hair every single. So you have to say tresses, and yeah, it was just a nightmare. Cutie or
But I think
just
that was
guy. The way
actually,
to say guy. Yeah,
I think that some of that, the goofier euphemisms, was a holdover from Helen Gurley Brown, because she was such a titan. And
yeah,
she, she, I think, stepped down in the 90s. And then I think maybe it was Bonnie Fuller, then Kate White, I forget. But around the time
yeah.
I left, they were really having a conversation about, we need to maybe like update some of this
The language.
language, especially the
Yeah,
younger women who worked at Cosmo were kind of like, we don't say any of this stuff. So I think they updated it right around that time.
it's so funny
I,
to read.
I would just
Go
add
ahead.
to what Kai said when you were asking about editors. And he said that they know what they want. One editor, whose name I shall not mention, with a couple of articles I wrote, the man's point of view thing, said to me, yeah, it's not quite working for me, but I'm not sure why.
Yeah.
And it's basically, I wanted to say that could not be less helpful. I
Right.
mean,
The worst note.
it's fine to say this or that or whatever, but that kind of ambiguous, ambivalent, just go and do something else. Or I
Yeah,
kind
just
of like the subject matter, but is it the position? Is it the flow? Whatever. So I love editors. I've been very lucky to work with those who, when they see something that's not quite working, they can explain it and say why you went off the track here. Specifics, details, clarity of vision, and maybe your visions are a little different, and ultimately you decide like, okay, I don't want to say what you want me to say here. Let's agree to disagree, but I'm going to do it in a persuasive way or an open-ended way. But just to shrug your shoulders, like, well, then you shouldn't be cashing a paycheck as an editor if that's your response.
right.
One of my
Go ahead.
real quick.
Kai.
This is from the Maxim days, the Dennis Publishing days. A guy who's an amazing editor did an edit on a colleague of mine, and my colleague walks over and shows it to me. He was kind of new at the time. He's like, "What is this?" And the editor, all he had done, like when you play the game Hangman. So
Yeah.
he had like drawn that hangman figure with an arrow pointing toward it, and it just said "me." In other words,
Oh, really?
having to read this made
Oh my
me
God.
want to, and I
wonder, I might know
so
who
hard.
that editor. That's so good. Well, I used
It's
to have an
so good.
editor who is kind of prominent today, who used to just write lame. He would just write in the column next to it, lame, like if you made a joke. And
I know exactly who you're talking about.
Exactly. Who will remain nameless. That was a really not helpful note, and it made me want to leave that job. And I did eventually leave that job, but it was obviously be specific. Guys, this has been so interesting. I don't know if there's any questions. Let me see if anybody has any questions. No questions so far. Oh, well, okay. Well, I'm glad that everybody joined us. Are you as good at giving advice as you are at following it? Or you maybe it's the opposite. Are you as good at following advice as you are at giving it? I'm terrible at following my own advice. I'm pretty good at giving advice, but I'm pretty much the worst at living my life. No, that's not true. But you know what I mean? Like it's definitely like the stuff that I would write in a column is not the way I would necessarily play out relationships in my real life. That's my true confession here. Sometimes I feel like if I was just more Jake-like in some of my relationships, I might have been, they might have gone a little bit better. I don't know.
I mean, I guess what I'd say, I want to go back to something Kai said about, actionable advice that one gives. I think the role of the columnist, not to sound too high-minded about it, but what we guys did, is just to get someone to think slightly differently or more openly about what it is that's troubling them. But the idea about like, yeah, you really need to break up, or you're a wuss, or change cities, or do this or do that. That there's so many factors that go into that. It's like,
Yeah,
you shouldn't be listening to some anonymous guy. But
telling.
I hope in reading this column or reading these questions and answers that it gives you pause, or gives you like a crack in the door to seeing a slightly different way of looking at it. And that, if we've done that, then we've sort of done our jobs, and that's probably the most. But sure, if you're dealing with someone who says, my boyfriend likes to expose himself, hey, is there something wrong? That's on the level of, okay, some professional help really needs to come
that was
here.
where I went with it.
Yeah, but with a lot of the stuff, at least that I was doing, I felt like you want them to like either smile or frown at what you're writing about, because yeah, darn, that confirms what I think about guys or about my guy, whatever, or laugh at something that now you can look at a little bit lighter. But I would hesitate to think that there's ever a moment where it's like, don't follow what I'm saying. Just read it and move on.
Right.
What do you think, Kai?
What do you think, Kai?
I think when I was doling out this advice, I think one of the reasons I was maybe not bad at giving advice about boyfriends or guys who weren't great was because I'm like, I remember myself in my 20s. This guy reminds me of myself in my 20s. And so I can now give advice about how to deal with that guy. But yeah, John, you said that you're not great at taking your own advice. I think I'm pretty good about giving advice generally. And like you said, Andrew, it's not like, here's what you should do. It's like, well, you should think about this. How do you feel about this? But terrible at taking my own advice. And I think just generally, I'm pretty closed off. I like try to avoid telling anyone about myself that would prompt them to give me advice. Right. So.
Right. By the way, I realize in what you just said, Kai, that we've pretty much outlined what typical therapy is like, well, how do you feel about that? How do you feel? And yet you don't say, do this, do that. It's like, you've got to come to it yourself. So,
right. That is really the, if you haven't been in therapy, I mean, a good therapist will let you come to it yourself. I ended up marrying a therapist, which is probably, again, my karma for having done this for years in my 20s, pretending to be a therapist, and not really doing a great job. And then it was great because when she came into my life later, when I was writing Cosmo, she would help me write a lot of those columns. We would role play. I'd be like, yeah, she would give me some great answers. All right. This has been, I realized I didn't even talk about what you guys are up to these days. Like, Andrew, you're a writer, you mentioned, what are you up to these days?
I collaborate on a lot of books, almost all nonfiction. Awesome. And I've been very lucky to have it be across a real wide range: business, health, pop culture.
Awesome. What are some
all kinds of things?
What are some of the most recent ones that we
well, even though most of them have to do with are helping people to tell their story, one project recently, which I enjoyed, I got the opportunity to update How to Win Friends and Influence People, the Dale Carnegie self-help book,
of course,
and which I happen to love. And it had only been updated once in the last 90 years.
Oh,
and again, talk about giving advice. I mean, here's a book that
the original,
a cottage industry itself. And there it was really more about updating language and, every example there, a woman was a wife and homemaker or a secretary or this or that. And even though the idea was not to suddenly make it seem as if Dale Carnegie was alive 70 years after he died, just being more aware for a reader now and how they might respond. So I had a chance to work.
I think a lot of the bites there, like you're saying, is timeless, right? A lot of his advice.
I think it's the kind of granddaddy or grandparent or whatever of advice books. I mean, if we remove religious texts as advice books, I think it's so simple and so universal. I'm not like shilling for it right now, but I liked the book before I got the opportunity to do it.
You're making me want to at least listen to it again. I haven't read it in a long time. Kai, what are you up to these days?
I'm still do freelance journalism, a lot of celebrity related stuff, being here in LA, but I'm now a journalism professor at Loyola Marymount University.
Awesome. From guy guru to journalism professor, there is hope.
With a few things in between.
Yeah, exactly. No, you were at Vice, you were at a bunch of places, but right?
Yeah, I think that's what helped me get this gig versus maybe the guy guru stuff. Although I talked about that Cosmo and that stuff in class.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for taking time and strolling down memory lane with me. This has been fascinating. I've wanted to meet some of my fellow columnists, so advice columnists. So this has been really interesting. And best of luck to you. And thank you everybody for listening to and watching this podcast. Please subscribe if you're watching Small Talk. We talk about, I don't know, things from the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. And so that's what you'll find. All right, guys. Until we meet again.
Thanks
Take
a lot,
care.
John.
Thanks.
All right.